put the salt in it when they were tempering them at the end. And there's all kinds here. There's the kind you see in the movies where they, the cowboys had them and they were drinking out of them. And, that's in the Wild West. That's what you see on TV. A lot of these were used for just about everything. Like they had vinegar in them. They had their whiskey was in them, of course. But the whiskey came in barrels, in wooden barrels, when they shipped it out west to the western part of the United States, and then they poured them into these crocks. This is one of the older crocks. You can see how it's not completely round. It's got an oblong look to it because of the way it was made, and it's got the salt glaze on it. Down on the bottom of the crocks, or somewhere on the side of the crocks, is usually a marking that'll tell you the manufacturer. I don't have any of them because most of the older manufacturers mark their crocks. You'll see a manufacturer's mark here, the crown. You'll see a name on the crock over there. And on the very bottoms or on the sides, sometimes you'll see a stamp mark. The older crocks will be made by Monmouth Company out of New Jersey. There was a Red Wing company out of the western part of the country that made like more of a darker red crock. Depends on what they use to fire them with. There were two local manufacturers. One was in Pittston and one was in Binghamton, New York. I made the mistake early on of making a lot of mistakes selling antiques and things that I didn't know anything about because I was young and like everybody else just thought it was old stuff and sold it. But I had a crock. I had a probably this size crock with a beautiful blue bird on the side of it that said White Utica on it. And I sold it for $100 thinking I got a real good deal because I got it for nothing. I found it. It was in an old shed that was being torn down, an old coal shed. And when I was digging the coal out, it was buried underneath it. Well, I thought it was a great deal, and then I find out now that they're selling anywhere from $500 to $1,000 for the same crock. And, you make those mistakes. I did the same thing with depression glass when I was a young kid, 20 years old. I sold depression glass for like $1 a piece, because to me it was just glass that was laying in our basement. So the crocks that are here, like I said, are not really, really old, but they're not modern. The bigger crocks, these are jugs, these are crocks. These crocks were used for just about everything from pickling to jelly, making jelly. They made sauerkraut in them, but in the early days they were made for liquids. Because they're whole liquid, so they put just about everything in these, and they covered them with lids like this. They all had lids. This is a lid, but the lid's missing. It's broke off. And some of these are bases. This is a very, very old one too, this one here. You'll see all the imperfections in it, and you'll see how it's not perfectly round. This is handmade, hand-fired. That's a really old one. They come in sizes from 1 quart to 2 quarts to 1 gallon to 2 gallons. This is a 12-gallon. And can anybody tell me what this is? Does anybody know? Sure? No. I bought this in Virginia, and I said, oh, I got it, look, a nice crock, and I bought it, and carried it out just like this, and there's no bottom on it. So I didn't know, I said, what is this? So I took it, and I was showing somebody, and they told me, oh, they said, you know what that is? I said, no. See the little hole there? It's a bird feeder. I didn't know. You fill it up, you put the bottom on it this way, turn it over, and the bird seed comes out that little hole, and then the birds stand on the side of it and eat the bird seed out of it. So I know that I'm the only person in Germany that has a crock bird feeder. I don't know what this one was used for. This was one of my last purchases. And I can't remember if I got this in Virginia or not, but My wife never knows what I buy because I try to open the trunk and put it in without her seeing it. This is another old one. This is another one that was used for pickling. They use these for beans. When they were making beans, they put them in an old bean pot. And I think that's about all I'm going to talk about on the crocks. There are some that were made for syrup. They have the pouring spout. This is a very old one. This one you can see it's got a mark on it like a bottle would have, like a Ponto mark on the bottom. And these are syrup jugs. And this I believe is a replica. You can see the shiny glaze on this and the blue that's on there. They're trying to reproduce these and make people think they're old Crocs. So this is one I think I paid $1 or $2 for, just to have something different. So I'm going to let Nick speak after that, because if you have questions on Crocs, I can Google just about anything you want, and you can Google just about anything you want on jugs and Crocs, because everything is out there. There's at least 10 different places where you can go and find more information about Crocs and jugs and where they're made. And with that being said, I'm going to introduce a guy I met a long time ago.
Not very big, not there, not there.
The $12 one? The 12-gallon one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We used to have, we had a picture of my grandmother. She was all pregnant, she was a Snyder. She got 3 of them in a bucket, and she come to town every day with milk from Snyder's son. And she took it out of them, just like that.
Tip it out. So there's another use. There's another use for them, was taking the milk out before they put it in.
I never saw that big.
Now a lot of people use Crocs like these on their kitchen, on their stoves. They put their utensils in them for cooking. I've seen a lot of that, and I've gone into a lot of houses where people have Crocs on their countertop with all of their spatulas and everything in them. So they're getting multi-used again. But you can come up and look at them after we're done. There's all different sizes. The 2 Casey brothers are the 2 local ones that I know. That Casey brothers made whiskey back in the day down in Scranton. They were a whiskey distributor, so we know where they came from. The rest of them don't have names or markings except this one. And there's one, a Croc, the same name over there. This I just purchased from this young lady over here. And she didn't want it anymore. It's cracked, so it's not really as valuable as it could be. A jug like that would be about $150 if it was in pristine condition. In the condition it's in, it's worth probably 35 to 40, maybe tops. But you can see the different roundness of this compared to these. The style. This is the standard style that they make for most of your whiskey. This is a little bit older, and it's rounded on the top. It's not squared off here. So it's a little bit older Croc. And like I said, that one and that one. So that's the dates. Now, we're getting into bottles. He's probably going to explain to you how you can date your bottles. And bottles came here like about 1830, maybe. Somewhere around there is when they first started making glass bottles here. So, I used to have a bottle capper, but I couldn't find it to bring it here. I wanted to bring it. I had the hand bottle capper with crown caps. That was about 1920, I think, 26 maybe when they started making them. Well, with that being said, I'm going to introduce Nick Petula. Nick is a retired school teacher from West Scranton. He's a bottle expert, bottle collector like me, a paper collector, a stamp collector, what else? Baseball card collector. Just about everything I collect, he collects. So Nick, if you want to step up. Oh, I want to make a quick commercial announcement. Over on the table is postcards that are $1.25. There's glasses for the 150th anniversary. There's coins from the 150th anniversary. And I have the books from the 150th anniversary. The books are $10. The coins are $10. The postcards are $1.25. The glasses, I think, are $10. And the beef sticks are 2 for $3, and that's what funds our building. And for you, anybody who doesn't know, we purchased a building over on Madison Avenue, which was the old Curry House. It was a Welsh Congregational Church in the 1800s to 1913, and we're restoring it into a museum, research center, library, hopefully a senior center as well, for people to go and just sit down and relax. So that's where the funding comes from, and I just let Nick take over from there, and you're on.
Okay, thank you, sir. Okay, I hope, if you can't hear me, please just raise your hand. I'll speak up. I thought Bruce would have a beautiful microphone system here and some AV materials and all, but, you know.
I can go get you one. I have one of them too. It's a karaoke machine.
Oh, good. Well, I don't know how many of you people are just interested in local history, local topics, or how many people are really bottle collectors. When you say, are you a bottle collector, usually someone who's not familiar with it thinks, that's kind of weird. Now, how many people collect bottles, and why would you collect bottles, and what would be the purpose of having bottles in your house that weren't filled with something? I kind of thought the same way. The way I got into bottle collecting was probably around 45 years ago or so. In my neighborhood in North Scranton, they were digging up railroad tracks at the time. What they were doing is reclaiming the steel rails, the tracks that weren't being used anymore. When they were digging up the steel rails to reclaim them, a neighbor of mine discovered that to fill in the sides, they had used ash. At one time, many of you might remember, at least in Scranton, whenever they collected garbage one day, the next day they collected ash, since almost everybody used ash, used coal in their homes, so there was lots of ash every week. And instead of putting the glass bottles or any kind of glass material in with the garbage, the city required you to put it in your ashes. So when they collected the ashes, there was always glass mixed in with the ashes. Ash was often used for fill for a lot of different reasons at one time. People used to use it in their garden. It's supposed to be great for tomatoes. They would use it for filling in any kind of depression in their yard. They would use it in the winter for traction in the cars and streetcars and things like that. And down near the Jaunty Silk Company, which used to be in near House Avenue in Scranton, is where they were digging up these O&W railroad tracks. And my neighbor, an old Navy veteran, for some reason went down there to watch them excavating, and he saw all these old bottles laying around. He started picking them up, looking at them, saw immediately that these were very, very old. He was kind of a collector himself, and he called me up and he said, I know you like this old stuff. I'm picking up an awful lot of bottles. They're just laying there. He said, nobody's doing anything with them. I don't know how they're going to clean this up. I went down, and to be truthful with you, I thought, this isn't going to be for me. And I said, yeah, that's interesting. I said, but I'm really not going to get involved with you. Maybe about a month and a half later, his son said to me that, boy, he's finding a lot of bottles with local addresses on them from the neighborhood. Providence, Pennsylvania, Hyde Park, Pennsylvania, Scranton, Pennsylvania, embossed right into the glass on the bottle. Naturally, most of these bottles at one time had paper labels. Once they're in the ground, that disintegrated pretty quickly. Well, to make a long story short, somehow or other, I went down, I found a couple of milk bottles, Woodlawn, Burchell, that kind of thing. It aroused my interest. I became enthusiastic. I contacted the original gentleman who had found it. He said, well, I'm digging. There's places where I dig, along the river especially. I said, I'd like to go with you. We went and we started digging, and it turned into almost an obsession with me for a while. I hate to say it. And we would dig down many times, 5, 6, 7, 8 feet. We'd work for hours, and I used to say, you wouldn't be able to pay me enough to work this hard and to work this long and work in these kind of conditions. The snakes, bugs, all kind of, who knows what kind of noxious materials were in some of these old medicine bottles. But it turned out to be really interesting. And wherever we saw somebody tearing down a building, digging a hole, any kind of construction, we'd go, and if we saw glass, pieces of glass. We could tell usually pretty quickly, was it a newer dump area, was it an older dump area? People used to fill their yards with all kinds of things in the past. And if we went to a excavation site and we saw that the glass was turning maybe a little purple, getting some color, usually mean it was getting old or had been old. If there was a screw top, or if there were still labels or something, we knew immediately, oh, this might be from the 30s, 40s, or 50s. We had no interest. We were interested in things that, even at that time, went back into the 19th century. I cannot recall exactly how the Scranton Times contacted me. And I don't know whether someone had told them about bottle collecting, but at that time the Scranton Times ran a feature every week called Focus. And they would take some item that they thought was interest, some topic that they thought was of interest, and they'd run a story about that particular thing. It was really great publicity for a lot of different types of venues. A reporter came to the house with a photographer. I called my buddy up. They made an appointment with me. I called my buddy up. He said, "Now, what are we going to talk about? What are we going to tell these people?" I said, "We're just going to tell them what we've been doing. And if they like it, they'll print it, and if they don't, no big deal one way or the other." Well, I made a copy of that original article. This is from November 1982. And as you can see, they gave me a full page. I mean, we couldn't pay for this kind of publicity. And I thought, well, it's nice, it's interesting, maybe some people are interested. It was a Friday night. I went out that night, came home, I don't know, maybe 11:30 in the evening. My father had a raft of papers, phone numbers, people that had called, people who were, it was unbelievable to me that there were that many people who really were enthralled by this subject. And one of the numbers was Bruce. That's how I first got to know him. And Bruce was saying, you know, we ought to start a bottle club, we ought to do this, we ought to do that. We talked about a lot of things. And over the next, I'd say 3, 4, 5, 6 days, I was contacted literally by probably close to 100 people. Now, a lot of them weren't interested in digging bottles. They were interested in the topic itself. Some were members of families that had been producing bottles, producing soda in Scranton, producing, they had been part of the dairy industry. Some people were very, very gracious and said, you know what, come on over. I've got a couple cases of milk bottles in the basement. You can have them. Some people, of course, said, I've got an old bottle that I'll sell you for $500,000, you know, that kind of thing. But I met a lot of interesting people, and I then discovered that there were people interested in this kind of unknown hobby. From there, I spent a lot of time. I got interested, especially in Scranton brewery items. I was collecting, at that time, brewery bottles, memorabilia, trays from Scranton breweries. Many of you probably are familiar with some of the more famous ones. The Standard Brewery, which was well known, went out of business in 1954. The Robinson Brewery, which was in business for 70-some years, starting back in the 1850s, and had a huge complex in Scranton on 7th Avenue, near about half a mile from where the high school is now. They had a huge brewery building, they had stables, they had a bottling building, they had all kinds of auxiliary buildings. They employed hundreds and hundreds of people. They produced unbelievably beautiful advertising materials, fans, trays especially, which of course today is very valuable. You want to do something interesting, go on to eBay, tap in E. Robinson, and you'll find most days numerous items, 50, 60, 70 items, bottles, collectibles, and the beer trays especially. Most Robinson beer trays today, they're selling in the $500 to $1,000 to the $1,500 to the $3,000 range, depending on which one it is and what the condition is and that kind of thing. There were a number of other breweries then that I was finding out. I was digging at that time, and again, if any of you are bottle collectors, you'd probably run into an A.W. Schrader bottle or a Spitzer bottle. These were soda manufacturers, but they also bottled for the breweries. The breweries had their own bottles, but they also contracted out. I guess business was so good. Okay. This is a A.W. Schrader. They call that a squat pipe. This bottle is probably from, and again, this is what we mean by embossing if you're not familiar with it. You know, it has raised letters. And this bottle probably from 1880s, 1890s. Then they changed to the more familiar, little bit bigger bottle. Around 1910, they developed what they call the crown top. And that's the kind of bottle that we now are familiar with, the metal top that's kind of squeezed on. And you can see the little ribbon around it. Before this, a lot of people think these were all corks, but they weren't. There were cork bottles, there were cork jugs. But the bottles, this particular bottle, was this type of top. It's a porcelain top. And it would often have the name right into the top also, which is, they're very collectible also. And there'd be a wire loop which would hook down and then would attach here. Kind of elaborate when you think about it. And obviously, very efficient. And these became extremely widespread. I've got, and Bruce probably has, dozens of different types of squat bottles locally. There's one that's been mentioned a lot of times, and you see it on eBay a lot. There's one called Kronk Beer, which is a Scranton production, and I still haven't been able to find out exactly what Kronk Beer is. I'm assuming it was some kind of Eastern European variety of beer. And as you know, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, and I'm sure there's many of us here, our grandmothers and grandfathers came from Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Russia, and they had their own kinds of beverages. One of the most famous Eastern European immigrants was a man named Michael Bozak. And if there's any of you that are bottle collectors, he produced numerous bottles, jugs, and they're very collectible today. And he opened a winery in South Scranton. He also became extremely successful as a banker, especially to Eastern Europeans, and he became extremely successful as an exporter-importer of all kinds of goods. And he built a financial enterprise on Lackawanna Avenue. He had his own bank. It was the Bozak Bank. He was going to be patronized mostly by Eastern European immigrants, but he also had all kinds of contacts financially throughout the city. A very important individual, and it all came crashing down with the Depression. He overextended himself with the financial problems that developed in the late 20s. He lost just about everything. A lot of people, my own grandmother included. My grandmother was a Ukrainian immigrant, and like many of the other Eastern Europeans, she put all of her money into the Bozak Bank. She often talked about it in later days. She lost everything. I think she mentioned the sum of around $400, which to us maybe doesn't sound like too much, but to her, it was practically the end of the world, especially with the Depression beginning. My grandfather, 1930, was killed in the mines, so this was a real blow to her. So the name Bozak today, among people from that generation, it's a little unsavory. But to collectors, a lot of people are very, very happy if they come across a Bozak item. And there's a lot of them out there, surprisingly. Just to regress for a minute, as I said, I said that I was wondering how many people really think anything about bottle collecting. How weird is it to be a person to be out collecting bottles? But there's actually numerous magazines. This is probably one of the most popular ones. It's called American Digger. And as you can see, it's a national magazine, glossy cover, glossy sheets. They talk mostly about metal detecting, and they talk about coins and Civil War bullets and that kind of artifact. But they always have articles, as you can see, about bottles, because whenever you're digging anywhere, you're going to come across bottles. I would bet that almost every home up and down this valley that was built before 1950, somewhere on the property, if you dig down deep enough, there's going to be discarded bottles. There's going to be old ash, there's gonna be something that was, part of the garbage. All right, now I don't know too much about these, Bruce, so these are what are called, you hear the term a lot, blob top, for old bottles. These are true blob tops. A lot of people confuse blob tops with Hutchinsons. And, want to grab a Hutchinson?
These are our two local bottles. They're the only two we have. One is Muldoon's and one is Bottle. Bottle is still in existence today.
And again, I guess as you become a bottle collector, you start learning these terms because you start digging bottles. You dig a bottle as a bottle. I started digging this type of bottle down near the Lackawanna River. The Lackawanna River in the Park Place section where I'm from was going to be one of the oldest sections of the city, part of Providence Township. And the river in that area would often flood, and it was very, very flat. Originally, that whole area around the Lace Works, around Western Field, it was a huge plain. And when the river rose, that river spread for blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks. So somewhere in the late 1880s, 1890s, the city, when they collected their garbage, started dumping it along the river. Environmentally, kind of silly. Even civil engineering wise, I don't know how smart it was to dump garbage and ash along the river, but it was done for years and years and years. And little by little, they built up the banks of the river. And eventually, it became to the point, it didn't stop the flood, but it certainly began to stabilize. Trees began to grow in the ash, bushes, weeds, all that kind of thing. Topsoil eventually covered a lot of it over the years, as you're talking about all the trees and all the leaves falling and new topsoil being formed. So that when I started digging there, my friend John, as I said, we began digging and finding all kinds of unbelievable, interesting items. I found porcelain signs that the kind that used to be in stores, this high, a little bit rusted, a little bit chipped, but treasures for me. Also found unbelievable amounts of hot water heaters, metal hot water heaters, which people would just throw in the garbage and they would just dump them along the river. Dolls' heads, parts of old dolls, porcelain dolls from the 1800s. I found one time a tin box, and I thought it was very, very fragile. And I thought, what could be in something like this? I opened it up, and it was filled with standard beer labels from about 1914. And I thought, what kind of mystery is this? I mean, I was thrilled, obviously, to find an intact beer label. There were about 20 of them in there, in beautiful shape. And what probably had happened, my buddy John, much older than me, had a little bit better intuition about how these things might happen. He said probably a lot of times that in the bar, they would empty bottles they would throw in an ice bucket, or were in an ice bucket. The labels would peel off. Somebody probably just scooped the bottom of a bucket of old labels and threw them in this piece of tin and then threw them in the garbage. Fortunately, for me anyway, those labels were preserved and they're kind of rare now. People do collect beer labels also. Again, that's another thing. You go on eBay, you're going to find E. Robinson beer labels for sale. They're not horribly expensive. There are some different varieties that are rarer than others, but for the most part, you have to remember, as I said, Robinson was in business for many, many years, and a lot of people kept a lot of things, especially going back to the trades. They were useful, they were utilitarian. You could take a beer tray and use it in your house, and use it for a serving tray, and use it at Christmas, and they were some of them were extremely beautiful. The most famous one, probably the most common one, and those of you that may be familiar with local beer production, it was called the Factory Scene. And it's got a beautiful picture of the E. Robinson factory on Linden Street, horses and wagons going in and out. The bottling works, the stables are all shown, that whole area. Now, the brewery was torn down around 1992 or 93. And that's where it's a bank now. It's a North Penn, a savings and loan. And Across the street now is all, if you remember that area, right near that area, the Mulberry Street Bridge went across. That area is now where the, as I said, the high school is, Redner's, that whole new highway system that they put in. It's all changed so dramatically in the last 30 or 40 years that it's almost unbelievable. As an aside, when they were tearing the Mulberry Street Bridge down, naturally I went down, see what was going on, take some pictures, and there were tons and tons and tons of ash all around the foundations of the Mulberry Street Bridge. The whole area was riddled with bottles. I went down there, I was in practically in heaven. I started looking at everything just laying around as they were digging up that area. Unbelievable amounts of milk bottles. Milk bottles are real survivors, I call them, in the glass world. They really were made well, they held up. For some reason, there was always a deposit usually on milk bottles, but for some reason, a lot of people threw them away. I have advertisements in the newspaper from the different dairies saying, please return our milk bottles, we're short, we need milk bottles, everybody's throwing them away or keeping them in their attic or doing something with them, and we'll pay you a certain number of pennies, a few pennies a piece, bring the bottles back. But I think anybody who collects bottles, everybody's got a Woodlawn bottle, everybody's got a Berkshire bottle. A lot of people have another famous dairy, Brown Wright, Enderley Dairy, which is in North Scranton, Gracie Farms, which is in North Scranton. There's a whole pile of them up this way, which I'm not that familiar with all of them, but Dixon City, German,
Up here
Carbondale.
we had Matthijs's Dairy, which everybody knows. Nick Matthijs is 96 years old, and he was at our last presentation. We have a lot of his bottles over there. There's Arnold Dairy, which was up in RD German. There's Cure's Dairy. There's Stevens Dairy in Carbondale. And there's Hilltop Dairy. And there's Montail Dairy. And we have most of those bottles. They're the local ones from up here. This is what they call a 10-pin bottle. He didn't have one of these. This one, you'll see the imperfections in it, which tells you how old it is. Before they would stand bottles up like they have them on there, these were laid down on a table with a cork in them to keep the cork moist so that it wouldn't dry out, so your cork would be able to come out and go back in. And this is the way they kept their liquids in a bottle before they started making bottles that would stand up. So this is very old, and see the glass imperfections in it. This is what they call a 10-pin bottle.
I've seen bottles like that also with just a rounded bottle. Often they said they were ginger ale bottles. In England, they used to just make ginger ale out of real ginger. When they made the ginger ale, if they let it sit, everything would settle to the bottom and it would destroy the value of the drink. So they made round bottles that had to be stored upside down. That's also a ginger ale bottle. That's a different type.
As soon as he said that, this is a ginger beer bottle.
Yep. And those are usually, when you find them, I've built some of those, usually find them, they're usually English, with English companies on them. So obviously there was a big importation business also. A couple of other, this is again another aside. This is a Robinson beer bottle, embossed. It says E. Robinson Sons, Brewers, Scranton, Pennsylvania. They built their brewery in 1876. They had been in business before. The reason it says E. Robinson Sons is E. Robinson died. His wife took over. Her name was Elizabeth, and she pretty much gave most of the business enterprise over to her sons. And they became very prominent. One became a sheriff of Lackawanna County. They were all involved in politics. Another kind of interesting bottle, at least from my perspective, this is called a Cod Stopper. You can see it looks a little bizarre. These are mostly English, and it has inside, it did have inside, a marble, a regular marble. Those of us that played alleys when we were a kid, it looked just like that, and it probably was the same thing. And instead of using any kind of stopper, they stored them upside down also often. And the liquid would be here, the ball would fall down due to gravity, and the marble would stop the material from falling out. And then when they wanted to drink it, they turned it upside down, the marble would fall to the bottom. If they didn't finish whatever they were drinking, they turned it back upside down, and it was fresh and kept its fizz and everything else. They did have fizz, obviously, in those days. Speaking of fizz, all of us are familiar with Coca-Cola, and when Coca-Cola was developed in the 1880s, it became very quickly very popular nationally. And the Coca-Cola company in Georgia syndicated the rights to make and bottle Coca-Cola throughout the United States. In Scranton, you got one of those, I don't know whether it would be a contract or a right or whatever you would call it, but in those days, we're talking pre-1916, 1890s, 1900, the Coca-Cola bottle was brown, and it was a plain, regular soda type bottle, brown in color, but every city would be brewing or cooking or producing Coca-Cola in its own area. And every bottle would have on it the logo, the familiar Coca-Cola logo would be embossed on the bottle, and on the bottom would be the city, Scranton, Pennsylvania. And they're pretty rare. And I dug 7 in one day. Again, I know it may sound a little odd, you'd get thrilled over something like that, but I found 7 round Scranton Coca-Cola bottles, and all in the same spot, down along the Lackawanna River. Never found another one anywhere else out of all the different years and places that I dug. I'm sure they're somewhere, wherever that Coca-Cola bottling company was, I don't know. But those brown bottles, highly collectible. And there are people in the United States right now that try to collect every brown Coca-Cola bottle manufactured in the United States, which goes into the hundreds. New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, Los Angeles, Detroit, they all produced. In 1916, Coca-Cola Company decided to make their bottle distinctive, and they produced that distinctive hobble-skirted Coca-Cola bottle that we're all familiar with. And that became the standard. And that also, for many, many years, they also were bottled locally, and you'll find those hobble-skirted Coca-Cola bottles with Scranton embossed, usually on the bottom or along the side. Again, they're not as rare, they're still somewhat collectible, but monetarily, and when we talk about money in bottles, there's not a lot of money in bottles, even very, very old ones. A very fanatical collector sees something he really, really wants, he might go a little crazy, but for most parts, even things like a Woodlawn milk bottle, you'll see them online all the time, $4, $5, $6, $7. You'll see them at the flea market, $1 or $2. I used to have yard sales, and I had so many Woodlawn bottles, I put them out, $1 a piece. And people, they like them. They clean up nicely, they look nice, they're a sturdy bottle, put a flower in it, put something in it, a decorative item. When you get a chance later, kind of an example of all the different dairies. I have pictures of the dairies and of the spots where these businesses were. Some of them are a little unusual. Again, they can be of interest to somebody who's interested in our milk bottle collectors. As a matter of fact, Bruce, do you know that? The dairies in Lackawanna County. A gentleman who I don't know, Ralph S. Riviel, he produced this a number of years ago, and he took Lackawanna County and listed every dairy in Lackawanna County. And as you can see, it's unbelievably expensive. I mean, who would ever think in today's day and age? Of course, I'm not going to read this to you, thankfully for you, but I'm just going to run down quickly. He did it alphabetically. Abington Dairy, Adams Dairy Chinchilla, Ariel Dairy in Scranton, Arnold Dairy in Carbondale, Arnold's Farm Dairy in German, Arnold Dairy in German, BVS Dairy in Scranton, Bald Mountain Dairy in Scranton, Bald Mountain Dairy by a different owner, Bald Mountain, Missouri by Burke, Barbary Heights, Dalton, Bartholomew Brothers, Vanderlyn, Bell, Carbondale, John Bryant, Milwaukee, Bryant's Farm, Clark Summit, Blue Ridge Farm, Music, Carbondale, Dalton, Elmhurst, Scranton, Waverly, Clark's Green, Moscow. Unbelievable that, that there's this kind of interest in milk bottles. And if you're trying to put together a milk bottle collection, you've got a pretty big task in front of you. An interesting sidelight to milk bottles, for me anyway. I came across 2 bottles one day cleaning out an attic, and they were marked Woodruff, Dunmore, Pennsylvania. And I thought, boy, this is unusual. Dunmore bottles are a little bit tougher. You can find them. Soda, beer, Keystone Brewery, Dunmore. But I said, this is really different. And I put it in my collection. A gentleman came to me and said, I'm really interested in Dunmore milk bottle. I've been looking for one for years. He said, do you have one? I showed it to him. And he went, he was an old ex-Marine veteran. He was fanatical. He said, I gotta have that bottle. I said, I've got 2. They're both a little bit different. I don't want to sell it. I don't want to trade for it. He called me weekly, literally, for months. This is crazy. Finally, I was having a yard sale, and he stopped in. He said, you know what? I want that Dunmore milk. I said, I don't want to sell it. He said, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse. He was Italian. He was from Dunmore, so I don't know whether that's funny. And I said, he said, I'll give you $300 for it right now. Yeah. I said, all right. Because I figured, I could drop that bottle or somebody could kick it over. So, and I hope he was happy with the purchase. I didn't hope he didn't have any buyer regrets. I never saw him again. But
you were talking about the deposit on the book card.
Right, and you can see this one, it says 3-cent store bottle. And the prices of milk are very, very cheap. Quart of milk, I have a price list there if anybody's interested. I think it's from 1936, and it lists all the different prices of the dairy products, bottles, pints, everything else. Again, I can go on and on. I don't know how long I've been talking, and there's a million other things. Cream top. As I look around here, nobody's old enough to remember this.
Oh, yes. I remember. There's only 2 that aren't, maybe.
But in the 40s especially, the 30s, the 40s, when they delivered the milk, and they did deliver. I remember the milkman coming in the house when I was a child, all the time. And they would leave your milk at the doorstep, and they come collect on Saturday. But a cream top, the milk would produce the cream. The cream would rise to the top. And if you run a regular milk bottle, it would knock the cap off. And of course, that would be unsanitary. So they made this cream top. And the cream would fill this top. And they actually had a metal spoon, which you could get from the dairy. It had a little dip into it. I'm sure you have some, I have some. And you would take this spoon, and you dip out the cream, and you could use it for whatever, whether you were baking or making sour cream or whatever you were doing. That was going to be the whole deal with the cream top. But they're interesting, and again, they're not uncommon. Okay, obviously, milk bottles did come in different sizes and different colors.
That's the only one I've ever seen.
Yeah, you don't see many. I've never dug a milk bottle. I've literally dug probably hundreds of tons of soil in my time. Never found any kind of colored milk bottle. There are brown ones out there, I know, especially the later ones with the stenciling on it and with the printing on it. But it's something like this. Now this is from Binghamton, and again, I know nothing
I
about it.
was offered $150 for this 25 to 30 years ago.
Wow.
Guy from Binghamton who wanted it, and I was going to sell it, and I said, if he's offering me that much, it's got to be worth more. And I kept it. So it's been in my window in my house ever since.
You think again about pricing, as I said, bottles are not a real pricey item in most cases, but I went to a bottle show, and again, there are such things as bottle shows. And it was down past Allentown, and this was quite a while ago. And I came across a Hutchinson bottle, which I had. This, I don't have it here. the Hutchinson bottle, which is the squat type bottle, and it was from E. Robinson Brewery, but it was aqua blue, beautiful blue. I never saw anything like it, and I thought, boy, I got to have this. And I said to the guy, you know, what do you want for the bottle? $500. This is 40 years ago, and I said, I really like that bottle, but I've never seen another one. I kind of wish I had bought it, although who knows if it was worth anywhere near that, if he just threw a price on it. But I've never seen one on eBay, I've never seen one anywhere else. Well, as I said, I could probably go on and on, Bruce could probably go on, and we might begin to bore you to death, depending on your level of interest. But I'm going to stop. If you have any questions, if you have any anecdotes you want to share, if you have anything that you want to know about, I'm sure Bruce and I could give you some kind of sensible answer. If you want to look at things and if a question comes up when you're looking at them, feel free to ask. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope I haven't bored you too much. I hope you learned something. And if you come across any old bottles, call me instead of Bruce. Take them off your hands.
He's got a question for you.
Yes.
How many bottles do you have in your collection?
You know, literally, I have no idea. I got to the point when I first started, I took every bottle I dug, and we didn't go into things like medicine bottles. There's tons of Scranton, Wilkes-Barre medicine bottles embossed with the name of the drugstore, with the address. Very interesting, very fascinating. Old ink wells. Bottles that contain just ink, big bottles that contain ink, small bottles that contain ink, regular ink bottles that you put on your desk and put your pen into it and wrote out your letters or whatever. But I got to the point where I was digging so many bottles that I had no place to put them. And probably again about, might have been 42, 43 years ago, I dug a giant hole in my yard. I went down maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. I laid down cardboard, and I laid down hundreds of bottles, and laid more cardboard, and laid hundreds of bottles. Years later, I built a deck over that, so they're done, and maybe someday they're gonna. Yes?
What's the oldest bottle you found?
The oldest bottle I ever found was probably a Dr. Hollister medicine bottle, Providence, Pennsylvania. He had a shop. He had a doctor's office on Main Avenue, right up from Bull's Head. And Dr. Hollister was a very, very prominent physician, local historian. He wrote one of the first histories of Lackawanna Valley in 1857, which was reprinted, I think, 5 different editions. He was quite the guy. He also had an Indian arrowhead collection of over 10,000 Indian artifacts, which was written up at the time in all the newspapers, and which disappeared, which is a real mystery. It's a whole other story. I found his obituary, and his wife donated the entire Indian collection, all local. Local arrowheads, local Indian pottery, local Indian jewelry, stuff that's very rare and very underrepresented in any of our museums. She donated it all to the Everhart Museums. When I read this in the old paper was from 1908, 1909, somewhere around there. I called up the museum, this was in the 1980s, got a very ignorant curator, very condescending person, and I said to him, I'm interested in local history. I know that a large collection of Native American Lackawanna Valley Indian artifacts were given to the museum. He said, I don't know what you're talking about. We have no such thing. There's no such thing around here. You're completely wrong. I said, well, I can come over with the newspaper article showing it to you. A few months later, I came across an article from 1913, and it was called At Your Museum Today or something. It was written by a curator, a guy named R.A. Davis at the time. And in this 1913 article in the Scranton Republican, he said, we have just acquired Dr. Hollister's famous collection. It is now on view at our museum. So obviously there's a mystery. Whatever happened to that? Is it in the basement somewhere hidden away? Did somebody abscond the whole thing? Did all the county commissioners come in and hand them out to each other? Who knows? But all of that's, as far as I know, long gone. The oldest bottle the oldest piece of glass I have is on a visit to England one time. I was in Stratford upon Avon, and I bought two little inkwells, and they were probably from the 1700s. They were cheap. Again, England, they have big bottle collecting clubs. They dig a lot, and of course, you're dealing with a history that's thousands of years old, so you can find all kinds of amazing things. And they were selling, I bought two of them, they were a matching green glass, and they snipped the top. The top is very rough, but when they blew the glass, they just snipped it off, and then probably put a cork or a piece of cloth or something like that inside. But that's probably the oldest thing I have. If you go to Jamestown, if you go to Corning, New York, if you really want to see old bottles, the Museum of Glass in Corning, New York has an outstanding collection of all types of glass, and they've got Roman glass, Roman flasks, Greek, thousands of years old. Very, very fascinating. Anybody else? Yes?
Coke, maybe make a square bottle?
What?
Square bottle of Coca-Cola?
Not that I know of. As I said, I'm not an expert. Oh, yeah? Yeah. I'm definitely not, even though Bruce said we are. I'm definitely not an expert, because I always come across, like somebody will say, oh, you ever heard of the Scranton Dairy such and such? And I say, no. And I got a list there. But there were businesses that would come and go. And one thing about Coke bottles is I have some Scranton bottles that will have like Scranton Cola or the Coca name in it on the bottle. And obviously some kind of copyright rip-off. I'm sure they were usually short-lived. Most of the ones I have are from the 20s, and I think they were trying to take advantage of the Coke name. And I'm sure that legally those things are nipped in the bud. But there are Scranton bottles that say Scranton Cola or Coca spelled differently in some way. Spelled like Coca. Really? Yeah. Now again, there's probably all kinds of containers that the Coca-Cola company might have used. Like they used to sell syrup by itself, the drugstores and things like that. So you get a bottle, a big brown bottle, it was nothing but Coke syrup. And then at the drugstore, you mix your soda or your drink or whatever. Yeah, that does sound interesting. Anything else? As I said, feel free to take a look. There's some interesting things here. Most of it's Bruce's. I've got a few interesting things, as I said, but if there's anything we can help you with, and again, thank you very much for coming out on this bad night, and thanks for your attention.
All right, I'm gonna go over there to the table if you want to look at it. I can explain to you how the bottles are dated and